She wasn't moving. She was curled on her side in the frozen grass beside a creek in the middle of nowhere, Montana, her coat shredded, her face so swollen she barely looked human. Blood had dried across her temple and soaked through the collar of her dress. Elias Crow pulled his horse to a hard stop and stared down at her. He had seen dead animals in fields before. He had never seen a human being left like one. Then his daughter Rosalie grabbed his sleeve with both hands. "Papa." Her fingers just moved. Before we go any further, if stories like this one touch your heart, please take a second and subscribe to this channel. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. And when you're done watching, drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to that frozen creek in Montana and the woman nobody was supposed to find. The creek didn't make a sound that morning. It had frozen sometime in the night, the thin surface crackling, where the current tried to push through underneath, and the entire valley had gone the kind of quiet that only came when the cold was deep enough to kill. Elias Crow had ridden out before sunrise to check the fence line on the northeast corner of his property, the same fence line that had been giving him trouble since October. And he had brought Rosalie with him because she had begged him with that particular look she had inherited from her mother, the one where she pressed her lips together and tilted her head just slightly to one side. And he had never once in his life been able to say no to that look. She was 6 years old and she was already better at handling him than most grown men. She rode in front of him on the saddle, wrapped in his coat over her own, her small boots barely reaching the stirrups, her dark hair stuffed up under a wool hat that was 2 sizes too large. She had been talking the entire ride out, the way she always did, filling the silence with questions about why ice was clear and not white like snow, and whether horses dreamed. And could they name the new calf something other than Biscuit, because she felt Biscuit was not a dignified name for an animal. He had told her Biscuit was a perfectly fine name. She had told him he had no imagination. He hadn't argued. The fence line looked all right when they reached it, which surprised him. He had been expecting another section of broken post, maybe wire down across the ground, the way it had been 3 weeks running. But everything was standing. He dismounted and walked the length of it with his hands in his coat pockets, Rosalie sitting up on the saddle above him, watching like a small, serious supervisor. "It looks fine," she announced. "I can see that. So we came all the way out here for nothing. We came out here to check, and now we've checked." "That's right. Can we go see the creek before we go back?" He looked at her. She had that look again. He said nothing and turned his horse north toward the tree line, where the creek ran, and she made a satisfied noise and settled back against his chest when he remounted. They followed the bank for maybe a quarter mile before Elias pulled up. Something was wrong. He didn't know what it was at first. His eyes moved across the frozen grass, across the dead cattails bent low under ice, across the dark shapes of bare cottonwood trees lining the opposite bank. Everything looked the way it always looked in January. Cold, still empty, but something snagged at the back of his mind. He looked again, and then he saw it, a shape in the grass about 40 feet ahead, half hidden against the bank where the creek curved. It was the wrong color, too dark against the pale winter ground. Too rounded in a way that the landscape didn't explain. He didn't move for a moment, he just looked at it. Rosalie had gone quiet, which almost never happened. He felt her lean forward slightly in the saddle. "Papa," she said, her voice gone small. "What is that?" He didn't answer. He nudged the horse forward slowly, one hand moving back out of instinct to hold Rosalie steady, his eyes fixed on the shape. As they got closer, the details assembled themselves into something his mind didn't want to accept. A coat, dark wool, torn at the shoulder, a hand, fingers curled, resting against the frozen ground. Dark hair spread out across the dead grass, a woman. He brought the horse to a stop about 10 feet away and sat very still, staring. She wasn't moving. Her body was curled slightly on its side, one arm tucked under her, the other extended toward the bank. Her face was turned away from him. The coat was doing nothing for her in that cold. It was too thin, and it had been torn open at the back, and he could see the dress underneath was not dressed for a January morning in Montana. She was not dressed for this at all. His first thought, the thought he hated himself for, was that he was already too late. Papa Rosalie's voice was barely a whisper. She's not moving. He put his hand on his daughter's shoulder and didn't say anything. Then Rosalie grabbed his wrist with both of her small hands, her grip tight and sudden. Papa, her fingers. She moved her fingers, I saw it. He looked at the hand resting against the frozen ground. He waited, and then he saw it too, the smallest possible movement. A faint curl of the fingers, like something a person does in their sleep when they're dreaming something difficult. He was off the horse before he finished the thought. He crossed the ground fast, crouching down beside her, and what he saw up close was worse than what he'd seen from a distance. Her face was swollen on the left side, the skin around her eye purple and stretched, a cut above her temple that had bled a great deal and then stopped. Her bottom lip was split. There were marks at her throat that looked like fingers. Elias Crow had seen men after fights. He had seen men after accidents. He had helped pull a man out from under a collapsed barn roof 2 summers back. He had never seen anything that looked like this. This was not an accident. Someone had done this to her deliberately. Someone had done this to her and then left her here. Is she alive? Rosalie called from behind him. She had not dismounted, and he was grateful for that. She's alive, he said. Is she hurt bad? He looked at the woman's face. He looked at her hands. He could see she was shivering now, very slightly, and the shivering was the only thing keeping him from completely losing his composure, right there beside that frozen creek in the January cold. She's hurt, he said. We're going to help her. Okay, Rosalie said. Just like that, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. He reached out and touched the woman's shoulder carefully. Ma'am, he said, can you hear me? Nothing, ma'am, my name is Elias Crow. I've got a ranch about a mile north of here. You're gonna be all right. But I need you to hear me if you can. The faintest sound came from her. Not a word, not even close to a word, but something. A breath that was slightly different from the ones before it. A change in the tension around her eyes. She could hear him. That's good, he said, and he was surprised by how steady his own voice came out. That's real good, ma'am. I'm going to move you now. Going to hurt. I'm sorry for that. But I need to get you out of this cold. He slid one arm under her shoulders and one under her knees and lifted her, and the sound she made, when he did, nearly broke something in him. It was not a scream. It was smaller than that, and somehow worse, a sharp, compressed sound like something Hercenter makes when they've already used up everything they had for screaming, and there's nothing left. I've got you, he said. I've got you. You're all right. He didn't know if she was all right. He strongly suspected she was very far from all right. But he said it anyway because he needed her to believe it, and he needed to believe it himself. He carried her back to the horse. Rosalie had already slid back in the saddle to make room, sitting up straight with her hands folded in her lap, her face very serious and very young and very steady all at once. He lifted the woman up in front of him, keeping his arm braced around her, and she listed sideways, and he caught her, and he felt her hand move slowly, weakly, and grip a fistful of his coat. She didn't let go. He turned the horse and rode hard for home. He didn't push hard enough to throw her around, but he rode as fast as he dared, and Rosalie sat in front of him without a word and held the woman's hand where it gripped his coat, and the woman, whoever she was, wherever she had come from, whatever had been done to her, held on. The ranch house was not large. It was a working man's home, practical and plain, built for function by Elias's own hands in the years before he married and retrofitted slightly. After Rosalie was born, a cradle corner added here, a second window put in there. His wife had made it feel like more than it was, with curtains and a braided rug and dried flowers hung in bundles from the kitchen rafters. She had been gone 3 years. The curtains were still there. He hadn't been able to take them down. He got the woman inside and onto the bed in the back room, the room that had once been storage and that he had half converted for a purpose he hadn't yet figured out. He got her out of the torn coat and saw what was underneath, and he turned away briefly and pressed his hand to his mouth. Then he turned back, because she needed him to, and he covered her in every blanket he owned. "Papa," Rosalie said from the doorway, "I'm going to make the fire bigger." "Good girl," he said, "and I'll heat some water. Good girl." She disappeared. He heard the clang of the stove grate and the rush of air as she opened the damper. He heard her moving around in the kitchen with the particular focused efficiency of a 6-year-old who had decided this was important and was going to do it right. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the woman. She was unconscious now, properly unconscious, which he thought was probably a mercy. Her breathing was shallow and a little wrong, not the easy in and out of sleep, but something constrained, careful, as if breathing hurt, even without knowing it hurt. He thought of the way she'd made that sound when he lifted her, and he thought the ribs were probably the answer to that. He reached out carefully and checked her pulse at her wrist. It was there, thin and too fast, but there he needed the doctor. He needed the doctor right now, and the doctor was in town, and town was 4 miles south, and he couldn't leave this woman alone, and he couldn't take Rosalie into town in this cold, and he had no one to send. He sat there for 3 seconds thinking about it. Then he went to the doorway. "Rosalie." She looked up from the stove. "I need you to stay here with her," he said. "I'm going for Doc Harlan. I'll be as fast as I can." "Can you do that?" She looked at him, then she looked at the doorway to the back room. Then she looked back at him. "Yes," she said, "I can do that. You don't have to go in there if you don't want to. Just stay close. If anything changes, I'll be with her," Rosalie said, as if he'd suggested she might sit in the corner and look at the ceiling instead. "Go get the doctor, Papa." He went. He pushed the horse the full 4 miles and knocked on Doc Harlan's door at an hour that was probably too early for knocking. And the doctor, to his credit, took one look at Elias's face and had his bag in hand before Elias finished the second sentence. "How bad?" was all Harlan said on the ride back. "Bad," Elias said. The doctor said nothing more until they arrived. When he came out of the back room 20 minutes later, he closed the door quietly behind him and stood in the main room and looked at Elias with an expression that said several things at once. "3 broken ribs," he said. "Dislocated shoulder, which I've set. Severe bruising across most of her torso. The cuts on her face will heal. The damage to her throat stopped. She was strangled, Elias." "Not all the way, but someone tried." Elias stood very still. "And the injuries," Harlan said carefully, "are not all the same age. Some of them are older, weeks, maybe a month, under the fresh ones." Neither of them said anything for a moment. "This wasn't one night," Harlan said. "No," Elias said, "I didn't think so. You know who she is?" "No. She have anything on her? Anything?" "Nothing," Harlan nodded slowly. "She might not wake up until tomorrow. She might not wake up at all. I have to be honest with you about that. But if she makes it through tonight, I think she has a real chance." "She'll make it," Rosalie said. Both men turned. She was sitting on the floor near the fireplace with her knees pulled up to her chest, her hat still on, watching them with an expression that did not invite argument. "She held on," Rosalie said, "the whole ride back. She held on to Papa's coat. People who are giving up don't hold on." Harlan looked at the little girl for a long moment. Then he looked at Elias. "She may be right," he said quietly. She was right. The woman made it through the night. She made it through the next day, burning with fever, moving in and out of consciousness in ways that were frightening to witness, calling out occasionally in a voice too low and distorted to make out words. Rosalie sat beside her and held a cool cloth to her forehead and talked to her in a steady, quiet voice about the ranch and the horses and the calf they hadn't named yet, and the reason why Biscuit was not a dignified name. Elias listened from the doorway and felt something in his chest that he didn't have a name for. On the 3rd morning, the fever broke. He was in the kitchen when he heard the change, not a sound exactly, just an absence of the labored rhythm that had been the soundtrack of the last 3 days. He set down his cup and walked to the doorway. Rosalie was sitting on the chair beside the bed. The woman's eyes were open. They were looking at Rosalie with an expression that Elias could only describe as confused and exhausted, and very, very careful. "Good morning," Rosalie said calmly, as if this were perfectly ordinary. You've been asleep a long time. Are you thirsty? The woman's mouth moved. Nothing came out. It's okay, Rosalie said. Papa has water. Papa, I'm here, he said from the doorway. The woman's eyes moved to him. He watched her take him in his height, his coat, the hat in his hand, and he watched the calculation that ran across her face, the instinctive assessment of danger. The slight tension that moved through her entire body the moment she registered a man in the room. He understood what that meant. He had not understood it 3 days ago, but he understood it now. He kept his distance. He stayed near the doorway. He said, "My name is Elias Crow. This is my daughter Rosalie. You're safe here. We're not going to hurt you." She looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes were gray, he noticed, a very pale gray, like winter sky, and they were sharp even now, even through the exhaustion and the pain. She was taking in everything, cataloging it. "Safe," she said. The word came out rough and barely there, like something scraped across gravel. But she said it. "Yes, ma'am, how?" Not a question. More like an argument against the word. He didn't flinch. "Because I say so, and because nobody who means you harm knows you're here." She was quiet for a moment. "Where is here?" she said. "Crow Ranch, north of Millhaven, Montana Territory." "I don't," she stopped, swallowed, started again. "I don't know where that is relative to where I was." "Where were you trying to get to?" he asked. She looked at the ceiling. Her jaw tightened, she said. He nodded slowly. "That makes sense." She turned her head and looked at Rosalie, who had been sitting very quietly during all of this, watching the conversation with wide eyes and making a point of not interrupting, which Elias recognized as an act of significant personal restraint. You were on the horse." "Yes," Rosalie said. "You saw my fingers move. You did it 2 times. The second time Papa saw too." Something moved across the woman's face. Something complicated and raw and quickly controlled. "What's your name?" Rosalie asked. The woman was quiet for several seconds. Elias had the sense she was doing something deliberate, making a decision about something. Then she said, "Clara." "Clara," Rosalie repeated, as if confirming it. "That's a good name. I'm Rosalie. Papa already told you he was Elias, but he goes by Eli when you know him better, and I think you'll know him better because we're not very good at being formal." Clara looked at his daughter for a moment, then barely, she almost smiled. It didn't make it all the way to a real smile, it stopped somewhere short, like something that had forgotten how, but it was there. "Rosalie," she said, "thank you." "You don't have to thank me," Rosalie said matter-of-factly. "We couldn't just leave you there. Papa says we always stop for people who need help." "It's a rule." Clara's eyes moved back to Elias. He shrugged slightly. "It's a rule," he confirmed. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at the ceiling. "I need you to know," she said, and her voice was steadier now. "Deliberate, that whoever finds me when they find me, it will be dangerous for you. I'm not telling you this to scare you. I'm telling you so you can make a choice while you still have one." "Who's going to find you?" Rosalie asked. "The men who work for my husband." The word sat there between all 3 of them. "Your husband did this to you?" Rosalie asked. Clara's silence was its own answer. Rosalie turned and looked at her father with an expression that was entirely readable and entirely furious, and very much her mother's expression down to the last detail. Elias looked at Clara. "What's his name?" he asked. "That doesn't matter right now. It might. What matters right now," Clara said, "is that he has money and influence and lawyers, and he owns half the county east of here. And he will tell everyone who listens that I am unstable. That I ran away from a loving home because I am not right in my mind. And people will believe him. Some might," Elias said. "But you're not in his county right now. He'll find it. Maybe. But until he does, you're going to rest and you're going to heal and you're not going to worry about what comes next." He said it simply, without drama. "And when something does come, we'll handle it then." Clara looked at him the way people sometimes looked at things they couldn't quite believe were real. "You don't know what you're saying," she said. "Probably not," he agreed. "But I mean it anyway." She stared at him. He looked back at her steadily and without flinching, his hat in his hands, his posture completely unguarded. After a long time, Clara looked away. She looked at the ceiling. She looked at the dried flowers hanging from the rafters in the kitchen, visible through the open doorway, the ones his wife had put there, and that he hadn't been able to take down. "You lived here with someone," she said. "My wife. She passed 3 years back. So am I." A silence fell. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind that forms when people have said something real and are letting it settle. Rosalie, who had been very patient for a very long time, leaned forward. "Clara," she said, "are you hungry? Because I can make eggs." "Papa lets me make eggs now. I only broke the stove once." Clara looked at her. Something happened in her eyes. Something that cracked open very slightly and very briefly, and let something through that might have been grief or gratitude or both at once. "I'd like that," she said softly. "Yes, thank you, Rosalie." "Good," Rosalie said, and stood up with great purpose. "Papa, move, I need the stove." He stepped out of the doorway. Rosalie moved past him into the kitchen, with the focused energy of someone who had decided that this was her job now, feeding this woman, and she was going to do it properly. He looked back at Clara. She was watching Rosalie through the doorway. The look on her face was one he would remember for a long time. It was the look of someone who had stopped expecting kindness so long ago that the smallest amount of it landed like something enormous. He didn't say anything. He turned and went to help his daughter not break the stove again. In the weeks that followed, Clara healed. It was not fast. It was not easy. There were days when the pain was bad enough that she didn't get out of bed, and days when the fever crept back and Rosalie sat beside her and talked steadily about horses and weather and the ongoing negotiation regarding the calf's name. There were nights when Elias heard sounds from the back room that weren't physical pain, a different kind of sound, quieter and more contained, the sound of someone who had learned that crying quietly was safer than crying at all. He never knocked on those nights. He understood, in the wordless way that grief teaches people things, that what she needed on those nights was not company. What she needed was to know that the door would be there in the morning. He made sure it was. She started getting up after the second week. First, just to the kitchen table, where she sat with coffee in both hands and watched Rosalie's morning routine, with an expression of quiet attention that slowly, over days, shifted into something warmer. Rosalie narrated everything she did as she did it. "This is how you bank the stove coals so they last. This is why the second shelf is better for the bread. This is the cup Papa always uses because it's the biggest one, and he thinks I don't notice." And Clarice listened the way someone listens who has learned to take nothing for granted. She moved better by the third week. She was careful about it, the way people are careful when they've learned that bodies are not reliable, but she moved. She came out to the porch in the afternoon, when the sun was at its strongest, and sat in the chair with a blanket over her shoulders and looked out over the land. She didn't talk much during those afternoons. Elias worked nearby and didn't push. Rosalie occasionally emerged to present opinions on various topics and then disappeared back inside. The land did the work that words couldn't. One afternoon in the third week, Clara spoke without being spoken to for the first time. "You have the accounts on the kitchen table," she said. "The ledger." He looked up from the fence post he was working on. "That's right, I looked at it. The December numbers don't add right." He waited. "The feed costs are entered twice in the second column," she said. "It's about $30 off. I can fix it if you'd like." He looked at her steadily. "You know figures? I ran a household," she said. The word "ran" contained about 10 years of experience, compressed into 3 letters. A large one, with a budget that was not often enough and an accounting that had to be exact or she stopped. "I know figures. Yeah, I'd appreciate that," he said. She nodded once, pulled the blanket a little tighter, and went back to looking at the land. He went back to the fence post, but he stood there for a moment first, looking at the back of her head, thinking about a woman who ran a large household on a tight budget under conditions that had to be guessed at, who had walked out of those conditions and survived being left to die in a January creek, and was now sitting on his porch correctly identifying errors in his December ledger. Nathaniel Voss, whoever he was, had completely underestimated this woman. Clara fixed the ledger. Then she found two other errors, both from November, and fixed those as well, and left a note in the margin in a small, precise hand that explained each correction. He found it in the morning before she was up and read it twice. She wasn't just competent, she was meticulous. She was thorough. She thought through implications and checked her work. He started leaving the current month's figures on the table, without saying anything. She started working through them, without saying anything. It became a thing that happened. Rosalie noticed, the way Rosalie noticed everything, and said nothing, which meant she approved. The first real conversation, not logistics, not medical, not the brief and careful exchanges of people figuring out how to share a space without frightening each other, happened on a Wednesday evening in the 4th week. Elias had come in late from the north pasture, and Clara was at the kitchen table with the lamp lit and the ledger open, and Rosalie was already in bed, and the house was quiet in the way it only got after 8 o'clock. He hung his coat, washed his hands, poured coffee. He sat down across from her, without thinking about it, the way he would sit down at his own table, and then caught himself and started to get up. "You don't have to move," Clara said without looking up. "It's your table." He sat back down. She kept working for a moment. Then she set down her pencil and looked up at him. "I want to tell you something," she said. He waited. "Not because you need to know, but because you should," she gestured slightly. "All of this, and because I think you're a person who will take it and not use it." "All right." She was quiet for a moment, arranging something. Then she said, "His name is Nathaniel Voss. If that name means anything to you, then you know why I ran." It did mean something. Elias had heard the name. Everyone in this part of Montana Territory had heard the name at some point. Voss was Eastern money come west, the kind of man who bought land and influence in roughly equal quantities and built himself into something that looked like respectability from a distance. "I know the name," he said. "Then you know he's not a man who loses things without looking for them." "No. He'll say I'm unstable," she said. It came out very flat, the flatness of something many times in the privacy of one's own thoughts. "He's been saying it for years. It's how he explains the things that happen. When I had a bruise that someone might notice, I was unstable and sometimes hurt myself without meaning to. When I looked frightened in public, I was unstable and prone to irrational fears. He's very good at it. He says it with such..." She stopped. Such genuine-looking concern. She looked at her hands on the table. "I have no money," she said. "I have no family that isn't more afraid of him than they are fond of me. I have no property in my own name, because nothing was ever in my own name. I have nothing that in a legal sense would prove anything." She said it very carefully, like reading from a document. "What I have is the truth, and the truth in his world is not worth very much." "Whose world is it here?" Elias asked. She looked at him. "Don't know," she said honestly. "That's what I'm afraid of." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. Outside, the wind pushed against the house, and the fire crackled and settled. "Clara," he said, "what do you need?" She blinked. It was a small thing, but he caught it, the flicker of someone who had been asked the wrong version of that question for so long that the right version caught them off guard. "What I wants, not what the law says." "What do you need to be all right?" She was very still for a moment. "Time," she said finally, "and somewhere to be while I figure out what all right actually looks like." She said it quietly, almost to herself, like something she hadn't allowed herself to say out loud before. "That," Elias said, "I can give you." She looked at him across the kitchen table with the lamp between them. "Why?" she asked. "You could have kept writing that morning." "You didn't know me. I was nothing to you." "You weren't nothing," he said simply. "Rosalie's right. People who are giving up don't hold on." Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked down at the ledger. "Your January numbers are going to be a problem," she said. "The feed costs went up, but the revenue estimate hasn't adjusted." "I know," he said. "I can run a projection if you'd like." "I'd appreciate that." She picked up her pencil. He picked up his coffee. Outside, the wind pushed against the house again. Inside, the fire held. And somewhere in the silence between two people who had both learned in very different ways that the world could take everything and still leave you sitting at a kitchen table on a Wednesday night, something very quiet and very real began to settle into the walls of Elias Crow's ranch house. Not a resolution, not yet. Just the first suggestion of warmth after a very long winter. The January projection Clara put together was more thorough than anything Elias had produced in 3 years of running the ranch alone. She had broken it down by category, noted where costs had shifted against the previous year, flagged 2 suppliers whose pricing had crept up in increments, small enough to miss if you weren't looking carefully, and written a margin note in that small precise hand of hers, suggesting he renegotiate the hay contract before March, because the spring price would be worse. He read it twice at the kitchen table the morning she left it there. And then he sat with his coffee going cold and thought about the fact that Nathaniel Voss had spent years telling everyone who would listen that this woman was not in her right mind. Rosalie came in from outside, stomped the cold off her boots, looked at the papers spread in front of her father, and said, "Is that Clara's work?" "It is. Is it good? It's better than mine." Rosalie nodded as if this confirmed something she had already decided. "She's smart," she said. "You can tell when she talks. She listens to everything, and then she says exactly the right thing. Not too much, just exactly what's needed, I noticed that." "She listened to me talk about the calf for almost an hour yesterday," Rosalie said, "and at the end she said maybe we should let that calf decide its own name by which one it responded to." She paused. "I've been testing it. The calf doesn't respond to biscuit." "What does it respond to?" Rosalie looked at him very seriously. "Margaret." He looked at his daughter. "Clara suggested it," Rosalie said, with the air of someone whose position had been professionally validated. "So it's Margaret now." He went back to the projection and said nothing, and Rosalie disappeared into the back of the house, and from somewhere down the hall came the low sound of Clara moving around. The careful, unhurried rhythm of someone learning how to exist in a space without bracing for the next blow. He had started to recognize that rhythm. He had started to understand, without her saying so, what it meant when she went still suddenly at a loud noise, or when she positioned herself near the door in a room, or when she tracked his movements just slightly. Not with fear exactly, but with a readiness that had been trained into her by years of needing it. He understood it because he didn't comment on it, and he didn't comment on it because commenting on it would mean she had to explain it. And she had given him enough of an explanation that night at the kitchen table that he didn't need her to give him more. He just moved predictably. He announced himself when he came in. He didn't raise his voice around the house. These were not accommodations that cost him anything. They were the ordinary decencies of sharing a space with another person, and the fact that they seemed to help her was something he turned over in his mind, sometimes when he was out working, wondering what kind of life a woman had to have lived for ordinary decency to feel like a gift. February came in hard. 3 days of snow that kept everyone inside and reduced the world to the ranch house and the barn and the narrow path between them. Elias made the path every morning and came back cold and loaded with firewood, and Clara made coffee without being asked, and Rosalie read aloud from the one school primer she had not yet memorized, and the 4 walls of the house held them all. It was on the 2nd day of the storm that Clara started helping, in a way that went beyond the ledger. She came into the main room while Elias was trying to repair a harness that had split at the buckle, and she sat across from him and watched him struggle with it for approximately 45 seconds before she said, "You're working against the grain of the leather. You need to push with the awl at this angle." She leaned forward and indicated with one finger, not touching, just showing, or it'll tear wider when you pull through. He stopped. He looked at her. "I grew up on a farm," she said. "Before." She said the word simply, without elaboration, in the way people say a word that contains a whole world they've closed the door on. "Show me," he said. She showed him. Her hands were steady and sure on the leather in a way that didn't match the careful way she'd been moving around the house. And he noticed that the way competence brought a different version of her out, a version that didn't look over its shoulder. "You're good at this," he said. I'm good at a number of things, she said quietly. He didn't find that useful. He didn't ask who. He didn't need to. It's useful here, he said. She looked at him briefly. Then she went back to the harness. They worked together in silence for a while, and Rosalie came and sat on the floor nearby, and drew horses in the margin of an old newspaper with a piece of charcoal, and the storm pushed against the windows, and the fire held. And it was the most ordinary kind of afternoon, and Elias thought that ordinary was a thing most people didn't know was a gift until they'd gone without it. Then Rosalie looked up from her drawing and said, "Clara, did you ever want children?" The question landed in the room like a stone dropped in still water. Elias looked up. He watched Clara's hands go still on the leather for just a moment. One moment, controlled and brief, and then she continued working. "Rosalie," he started. "It's all right," Clara said. She was quiet for a second. "I did. Yes, very much." "But you don't have any. Why not?" Rosalie, Elias said. "Papa, she doesn't have to answer if she doesn't want to," Rosalie said reasonably, and then looked back at Clara with the direct and unguarded attention of a child who genuinely wants to understand. "You don't have to answer if you don't want to, Clara." Clara set the harness down. She looked at Rosalie with an expression that was complicated and quiet and very adult, and she said, "It wasn't something that was up to me." Rosalie thought about this. Because of him, yes. Because he didn't want children, because he wanted. She stopped. She picked the harness back up. He wanted things a certain way. And children would have changed that. Rosalie was quiet for a moment, working through this. Then she said, "I'm glad you're here. I know that's probably not the right thing to say given everything. But I am." Clara looked at her. Something crossed her face that she didn't try to hide this time, and it was small. "It's exactly the right thing to say," she said. The storm ended on the third day and the world came back, and with it came the first hint of trouble. It was nothing obvious. Just a man on a horse on the road past the ranch, a man who stopped and looked at the property longer than a passing traveler usually did. Elias was in the yard splitting wood when he saw it, and he set the axe down and watched the man, and the man looked at the house and then at Elias and then moved on. He didn't know the man, but he remembered the look. He didn't say anything to Clara that evening. There was nothing to say yet. It was a man on a road looking at a property. There was no law against that. But he noticed, in the days that followed, that he started paying attention to the road in a way he hadn't before cataloging who passed and how often and whether anyone slowed. Clara noticed him noticing. She didn't say anything directly. But one morning at the kitchen table she set down her coffee and said, "How many people in Millhaven know I'm here?" He looked at her, Doc Harlan, and he won't say anything. "No one else? I haven't spoken of it. Rosalie hasn't been to school since the storm." He paused. "But this is a small county. People talk about things that don't concern them." "It's the nature of small counties," she nodded slowly. "How long do you think we have?" she asked. "I don't know. Maybe a while, maybe not." She looked down at the ledger. Her hands were very still on the table. "When he comes," she said, "he will not come alone. He never does anything alone. He'll have lawyers, and he'll have papers, and he'll have men who look respectable and say things in a tone of voice that makes everything sound completely reasonable." She said it the way someone says a thing they've rehearsed 1,000 times in the dark. "And I have nothing. I have no documentation. I have no witnesses to anything that happened before. I have nothing." She stopped. "Your word," Elias said. "Which is worth what exactly against his?" He was quiet for a moment. "More than he thinks," he said. She looked at him. Not with hope exactly. Hope was something she'd learned to be careful with, but with something that was evaluating the possibility of hope the way you test ice before you trust your weight to it. "He controls the narrative," she said. "He's been controlling it for years. He'll say I'm unwell. He'll say I left in a state of confusion and danger to myself, and that he is only here because he loves me and fears for my safety." She said the last part with a flatness that made the words ugly. "And people will look at him well-dressed, calm, a man of means, and then they'll look at me, and they'll decide which version sounds more likely." "Not everyone," Elias said. "Enough." He got up and refilled his coffee. He stood at the window for a moment. Then he turned back around. Doc Harlan documented your injuries, he said. All of them. Including the ones that weren't fresh. She went very still. He said you were treated for injuries consistent with repeated harm over a period of months, Elias said carefully. He wrote it down. It's in his records. Clara stared at him. He told you that? He told me that the morning after he treated you. He said. Elias set his cup down. He said if anyone ever came asking, he wanted his records to be clean and complete. She was silent for a long time. He doesn't know me, she said. No, he did that for someone he doesn't know. He's a decent man, Elias said. They exist. Not as many as there should be, but they exist. Something cracked open in Clara's expression. She turned her face away quickly, toward the window, and pressed her lips together, and he watched her get control of something that was clearly trying very hard to get out. He went back to his chair and sat down and looked at the ledger without reading it. After a moment, she said, without turning around, I don't know how to accept help. I noticed. He made accepting help into something dangerous. If you accepted help from someone, it meant you owed them. And the owing was always worse than whatever the help had been. That's not how it works here, Elias said. I know. She turned back around. Her eyes were dry, but just barely. I know that. I'm trying to make myself believe it. Take your time, he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she picked up her pencil and looked at the ledger. Your March hay estimate is wrong, she said. I know, he said. Do you want me to please? She started writing. He picked up the harness from the day before, the one they hadn't quite finished, and began working on the next section, and the morning moved forward the way mornings do when people have decided, without announcing it, to simply keep going. What happened next came on a Thursday. Elias was in the barn when he heard Rosalie's voice from the yard, not her usual voice, not the running commentary that accompanied most of her days, but a different register, higher and careful, the voice she used when she was being deliberate. He came out of the barn. There was a man in the yard. Not the man from the road, a different man, younger, better dressed, with the kind of clothes that said he'd come from somewhere that had more money than Millhaven. He was standing near the gate with his hat in his hands and a pleasant expression that didn't reach his eyes, and Rosalie was standing about 15 feet in front of him with her arms crossed and her chin up, and she was not moving. Who are you? Elias said, walking from the barn. The man turned and put on a wider version of the pleasant expression. Afternoon, sir. My name is Garrett. I work for Mr. Nathaniel Voss. I'm looking for... I know who you're looking for, Elias said. The man paused. Then the pleasant expression shifted slightly, recalibrated. Then you know Mr. Voss is very concerned about his wife. She left in a state of I'm going to stop you there, Elias said. He had reached the man now. He was taller than Garrett by 3 inches, and he had spent 20 years doing physical work, and he stood the way men stand when they are not performing, being unafraid. I don't know anything about your employer's wife. I don't know why you're on my property, and I'd like you to tell me which part of this situation you'd like to start with. Garrett looked at him. The pleasant expression had mostly dissolved. Sir, this is a legal matter. Is there a law being broken here? Mr. Voss believes his wife may be. I asked if a law was being broken. A pause. Not at this time. Then you're trespassing, Elias said. And I'd like you to leave. Garrett looked at him for a long moment. He looked at Rosalie, who had not moved and was still watching him with that chin-up expression that had won every argument she'd ever had with her father. Mr. Voss will be in the area, Garrett said. He'll want to speak with anyone who may have information. He's welcome to knock, Elias said, like anyone else. Garrett put his hat back on. He looked at the house once, a long, calculating look, and then he turned and walked back to his horse. Elias watched him go. He waited until the sound of hooves faded before he turned around. Rosalie had not moved. Good, he said, meaning several things. He looked at the house the whole time, she said. Even while he was talking to me, he wasn't looking at me at all. I know. He was looking to see if he could see anything through the windows. I know. She looked at him. Is she in there? Yes. Does she know? Rosalie nodded once. She uncrossed her arms. She looked at the road where Garrett had gone, and then she looked back at her father with an expression that was his daughter's face, and also somehow more older than 6, weighted with something that 6-year-olds shouldn't have to understand. He's going to come back, she said, isn't he? Probably, Elias said. But not today. He went inside. Clara was in the main room. She had heard it, or some of it, because she was standing near the interior wall with her hands at her sides and a stillness about her that was very different from the careful stillness she usually carried. This was a different kind, braced. That was one of his men, she said. Yes, Garrett. If it was the one I'm thinking of, his name is Garrett. That's what he said. She closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, they were very clear and very level. He'll report back tonight, she said. Nathaniel will be here within the week. Probably. Elias. She stopped. It was the first time she had used his name without the formal distance of Mr., and he felt it, and he thought she felt it too because she paused slightly when it came out. You need to think about what you're willing to risk. He will make this very hard for you. Your reputation. Your business. He has the ability to affect both, and he will use that ability without hesitation. He's done it before. To people who helped me before. She said the last part very quietly. There was a woman in town years ago. She let me use her parlor to sit for an afternoon when things were bad. He found out. He made her husband's business dealings very difficult for 6 months. Small things. Things he could deny, but she stopped helping me after that. I'm not her husband, Elias said. That's not the point. I know what the point is, and I'm telling you I understand it, and I'm not asking you to leave. She looked at him with that expression she had, the one that was measuring the ice, testing the weight. Why, she said, and it wasn't the same why as before, the one from the kitchen table weeks ago. This one was harder. Why is it worth it to you? He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the doorway to the hall, where Rosalie had gone, and he thought about how to say something true without saying more than he had earned the right to say. Because you fixed my accounts, he said finally, and you showed me how to work the harness. And Margaret responds to her name. He paused, and because when I carried you out of that field, you held on. And I've been thinking about that for 6 weeks, and I still think it means something. Clara stared at him. He turned and picked up his coat. I'm going to send word to Harlan, he said. He should know Voss is in the area. His documentation is going to matter, Elias. He stopped. Thank you, she said. It came out very plain and very direct, none of the polite formality of the first days, and he understood that she meant it as plainly as she said it. Don't thank me yet, he said. We haven't won anything. No, but you haven't run. He put his coat on and went for his horse. He was on the road to town when he heard hooves behind him and turned to find Rosalie on the smaller horse, hat jammed down, coat buttoned wrong in her hurry. Catching up with a look on her face that said she had made a decision, and he was going to need to accept it. You are not coming to town, he said. I'm not going to town, she said. I'm going with you to town. That is the same thing. Papa, she pulled alongside him. She's alone at the house. He looked at her. She looked back at him. She's been alone in that house before, he said. She's been alone in the house before when nobody knew she was there, Rosalie said patiently. Now somebody knows. And she's alone, and she knows that somebody knows, and that's different. That's the kind of alone that's very loud. He looked at his daughter for a long moment. You're 6 years old, he said. Yes, she said, and I'm right. He pulled his horse up. He thought about it. He thought about Clara in the house, standing near the wall with her hands at her sides and that braced stillness around her, and he thought about Rosalie's very specific and accurate description of the kind of alone that was very loud. All right, he said. We go together. We're quick. And you stay beside me, obviously, Rosalie said. They rode to town together. Doc Harlan's office was the same as it always was, practical, clean, smelling of the particular smell of a doctor's working space. Harlan opened the door and looked at both of them and said, This is about Voss, isn't it? His man was at the ranch today, Elias said, looking for her. Harlan didn't say anything for a moment. He stepped back and let them in. He went to the cabinet against the far wall and opened the second drawer and took out a folder that was thicker than Elias had expected. "I've been adding to this," Harlan said. He set it on the desk. "Every notation, every measurement, every observation." She presented with injuries consistent with sustained, repeated physical harm. "I've noted the differential ages of injuries, the pattern of the bruising, the damage to the throat." He looked up. "This isn't something that happened once. This is a record." "Will it hold up?" Elias asked. "Legally?" Harlan spread his hands. "That's not my world. But medically it's thorough. And if a judge or a jury looks at this alongside whatever Voss brings..." He stopped. "It's not nothing, Elias. It's substantial." She says he has lawyers. "I know. But lawyers work with what exists." Harlan tapped the folder. "This exists." Rosalie, who had been standing very quietly in the corner, said, "Are there other people who could say things? People in town who know about him?" Both men looked at her. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Harlan asked. "I mean..." She chose her words carefully, with the deliberateness of someone who has been paying attention to adult conversations for 6 years and has learned a great deal from them. "Men like that, he's been here before, right? In this area? He buys land and does business, and people have seen him. And maybe some people have seen things, or heard things that weren't quite right. They maybe didn't say anything, because there was no reason to. But if there was a reason..." She stopped. She looked at Harlan. "You've known people in this county a long time," she said. "More than us. Is there anyone like that?" Harlan looked at the 6-year-old for a long moment. Then he looked at Elias. "Your daughter," he said, "is considerably smarter than most adults I treat." "I'm aware," Elias said. Harlan sat down heavily in his chair. He laced his fingers together. He looked at the folder on the desk with an expression that was working through something. "There's a woman," he said slowly, "Margaret Hale. She was married to a land agent who did business with Voss about 4 years ago. Her husband came to me twice in 6 months with injuries that were called something else. Riding accidents, both times. He was quiet. He died in what was ruled a riding accident 8 months later. His land transferred to Voss in the settlement of debts." The room was very quiet. "She's still in the county," Harlan said. "She runs the boarding house on Franklin Street. She doesn't talk about it. But I've always thought she was waiting. For something." "For a reason," Rosalie said. "Yes," Harlan said, "I think so." Elias picked up his hat. He turned it in his hands. "Would you talk to her?" he asked. Harlan nodded, slowly, like a man who had been deciding something for a long time and had just finished deciding. "Yes," he said, "I think it's time." They rode home as the sun went low and the cold came back up, and Rosalie sat in front of Elias on the saddle and was very quiet most of the way, which was unusual enough that he checked on her twice. "You're thinking," he said.
"Yes, about what?"
"About what?" she said. "Clara. About how he makes the narrative and people believe it because he's calm and well-dressed." She paused. "He's not more believable because he's right. He's more believable because he looks like he should be right. And that's not the same thing." He looked at the back of her head. "No," he said, "it isn't. But Doc Harlan's records don't care what he looks like," she said. "And Mrs. Hale's story doesn't care what he looks like. And we don't care what he looks like." She paused. "That's what truth actually does, isn't it? It doesn't fight the same way. It just exists, and you put enough of it together and it doesn't matter anymore how calm he is." He held his daughter a little tighter on the saddle and didn't say anything. They came over the low rise and the ranch house was visible below them. The lamp lit in the window, a thin line of smoke from the chimney. Clara was still there. She had made supper. She was standing at the stove when they came in, and she turned and looked at both of them and did not say anything for a moment, just looked, the way someone looks when they were not certain. Someone was coming back and is relieved to be wrong. "You didn't have to do this," Elias said, meaning the supper. "I know," Clara said. "Sit down, both of you. You look cold." Rosalie hung up her coat and sat down at the table and looked at the food, and then looked at Clara with an expression of deep approval. "Is that biscuits?" she asked. "Real biscuits? Not the kind Papa makes where they're sort of..." "Rosalie," Elias said, asking. "Real biscuits. Clara said, and there was something in her voice very small, very careful, but there that was almost humor. Almost. They sat at the table together, the three of them, and they ate, and outside Nathaniel Voss was somewhere in this territory getting closer, and the week was growing shorter, and what was coming was still coming. But inside the house the biscuits were real, and the lamp was lit and the fire held, and Rosalie talked about Margaret the calf and Elias answered, and Clara listened and sometimes quietly, she spoke. And what was building in the walls of that house slowly, the way all real things build, was not just warmth. It was the shape of something worth defending. Nathaniel Voss arrived on a Tuesday. Elias knew it was Tuesday because Rosalie had been marking the days on a piece of paper tacked to the kitchen wall since Garrett's visit. A small serious calendar that she checked every morning with the gravity of someone monitoring something important. 6 days after Garrett, 5 days after Harlanson sent word to Margaret Hale. 4 days after Margaret Hale sent a note back that said simply, "I've been waiting for someone to ask." 3 days after Elias rode to the county seat and spoke to a man he knew there, a man who had once owed him a significant favor, and who now worked in the land records office, and who, after a long conversation and a longer silence, agreed to pull the documentation on Voss's property acquisitions over the past 7 years. 2 days after that documentation came back, and Elias sat at the kitchen table until past midnight reading it, while Clara sat across from him reading it too. Her face getting very still in a way he had learned, meant she was understanding something she had suspected, but not confirmed. One day after Clara looked up from those papers and said, in a voice completely without emotion, "He did this before me. There was a woman before me. Her name was Helen. I heard her name once, early in our marriage, and when I asked about her, he said she had been unstable and had gone to live with family in the East. I believed him." She paused. "I believed him for 3 years before I stopped believing anything he said. And then Tuesday morning came. Elias was splitting wood in the yard when he saw the horses on the road. Not one horse. 4. Moving at a deliberate pace, the pace of men who were not in a hurry because they did not believe they needed to be. He set the axe down. He did not go inside immediately. He stood in the yard and watched them come, and he counted them, and he recognized Garrett at the front, and he recognized the man beside Garrett by the way he sat a horse straight-backed, unhurried. The posture of a man who had spent his entire life in rooms where he set the terms. Nathaniel Voss was not what Elias had constructed in his mind. He was not large, he was not physically imposing, he was perhaps 50 lean, with the kind of face that photographers liked, strong jaw, clear eyes, silver at the temples, in a way that looked distinguished rather than old. He was dressed in a dark coat that was clearly expensive, and he wore it easily, and when he dismounted in front of the gate, he handed his reins to Garrett without looking and walked toward Elias with his hand already extended. "Mr. Crow," he said. His voice was warm. That was the first thing Elias registered, the warmth of it. Not performed warmth, not the warmth of a man trying to seem friendly, but the easy, practiced warmth of a man who had spent decades making other people feel that he was the reasonable one in every room. "I'm Nathaniel Voss, thank you for seeing me." Elias did not shake the hand. He let it hang there for one full second, long enough for Voss to feel it, short enough that it wasn't a scene, and then he said, "I didn't agree to see you." "You rode up." Voss lowered his hand with no change in expression. He tilted his head slightly, the way a man does when he's filing something away. "Of course," he said. "I apologize for arriving without notice. I've been worried about my wife. Is that right? She's been unwell. She left our home in a state of considerable distress, and we've all been very concerned," he said, the way Clara had described, with genuine-looking worry, the specific texture of a man who cares deeply and only wants to help. "I understand she may have come through this area. I'm not here to cause any trouble, Mr. Crow. I just want to make sure she's safe." "Safe from what?" The briefest pause. "From herself, primarily. She has episodes. I'm sure if you've encountered her, you've seen something of that." "I haven't said I've encountered anyone." Another pause. Slightly longer. Voss looked at him with those clear, steady eyes, recalibrating. "No," he said. He smiled. It was a good smile. You're a careful man. I try to be. Then let me be equally careful. Voss clasped his hands in front of him. I have documentation from 2 physicians confirming my wife's history of instability. I have a legal writ authorizing her return to my custody as her husband and her primary caretaker. And I have, he glanced briefly at Garrett, witnesses who can place her in this county. So I will find her, Mr. Crow. I'd simply prefer to do it with cooperation rather than without. The last sentence was very quiet and very pleasant, and had the specific weight of a man who had used that sentence before, and knew exactly how it landed. Elias looked at him for a long moment. I think you should leave, he said. Voss studied him. Mr. Crow, you came onto my property without invitation. You've made implications about a person I haven't confirmed knowing, and now you're making what sounds a great deal like a threat. Elias took 1 step forward. Not aggressive. Just closing the distance by enough that Voss had to hold his ground or step back. I'd like you to leave. You can come back with your paperwork and your lawyers, and we can have this conversation properly. But right now, today, you're going to get back on your horse. Something moved through Voss's eyes. It was very quick and very cold, and it was not the warmth that had been there a moment ago. Then the warmth came back, smooth as a card being turned over. Of course, he said. I don't want any trouble. I'll be in Millhaven. When you're ready to talk, I'm easy to find. He turned and walked back to his horse, took the reins from Garrett, and mounted without effort or haste. He did not look at the house. He looked at Elias. She needs help, he said from the saddle. I hope you'll remember that. Then he turned and rode back the way he'd come, his men behind him, and Elias stood in the yard and watched until all 4 horses were gone. He went inside. Clara was in the main room. She had heard it. The windows were not thick, and she was standing against the interior wall with her arms wrapped around herself. Not looking frightened exactly, but holding herself the way people hold themselves when they are working very hard to stay in one piece. He was here, she said. He was here. He was calm. Wasn't he? Very. She closed her eyes for a moment. That's when he's most dangerous, when he's calm. She opened her eyes. He'll go to town, he'll talk to people, he'll be gracious and worried, and everyone will feel how reasonable he is. Some will, Elias said, but Harlan's already talked to 3 people this week. And Mrs. Hale isn't someone who forgets things. Clara looked at him. Margaret Hale, from the boarding house? You know her? I know of her. I know what happened to her husband. She was quiet for a moment. She's willing to speak? She said she's been waiting for someone to ask. Something moved through Clara's face, complicated raw, and quickly gathered back in. She turned away. She pressed one hand to the wall and stood there for a moment, not speaking. Then Rosalie came in from the back of the house and looked at both of them and said, "He's gone?" "Gone," Elias said. "Good." She came and stood beside Clara, not touching, just near, with the instinct of a child who understood that sometimes near was what was needed. He had mean eyes, she said, even from the window. He was smiling, but his eyes weren't. Clara looked down at her. You saw him from the window, Elias said. I was watching, Rosalie said, unrepentant. You can't expect me not to watch something like that. Clara made a sound. It was not a laugh, not quite, but it was the closest thing to one that had come out of her, and Rosalie heard it, and looked up with a small satisfied expression, as if she had intended that all along. He didn't scare Papa, Rosalie said to Clara. Did you see that? Papa didn't shake his hand. I saw, Clara said quietly. Papa never not shake someone's hand, Rosalie said. He shook the hand of the man who sold him a broken plow, and didn't say a word about it until they were done with the handshake. So when he didn't shake that man's hand, she looked at Elias. That was on purpose. Everything I do is on purpose, Elias said. The broken plow wasn't on purpose. The handshake was. Rosalie turned back to Clara. See, she said, it's fine. We're fine. Clara looked at the little girl beside her. She reached out and put one hand briefly on Rosalie's shoulder, the first time Elias realized that he had seen her initiate physical contact with anyone, and then she straightened and looked at him. What do we do now? She asked. Now he said we go to Harlan. They went to Harlan that afternoon, all three of them, and Harlan's office was not empty. Margaret Hale was already there. She was a woman in her late 40s, plain dressed, with the kind of face that had been handsome once and was still good strong bones, steady eyes. The look of someone who had carried something heavy for a long time and had learned to carry it without showing. She stood when they came in, and she looked at Clara, and something passed between the two women that Elias couldn't fully read, but that he understood was significant. "Mrs. Voss," Margaret said. "Miss Whitmore," Clara said, with a firmness on the name that said something important about how she was thinking of herself. "My name before him was Whitmore. I'd rather use that." Margaret looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded, once, with the weight of someone who understood exactly why that mattered. "Miss Whitmore," she said, "my husband was Thomas Hale. He sold grain and managed land contracts, and 4 years ago he told Nathaniel Voss no on a land deal that Voss wanted very much. 6 months later, Thomas was dead." She said it straight, no preamble, no winding up. Just the facts, delivered like stones set in a row. "It was ruled an accident. I never believed it, but I had no proof and no money and a boarding house to run and nobody who wanted to hear it." She paused. "I want to be heard now." Clara sat down across from her. "Tell me about Helen," Clara said. The room went very quiet. Margaret looked at her sharply. "You know about Helen." "I know the name."
I found documentation. Clara glanced at Elias.
He reached into his coat and set the papers from the county records office on Harlan's desk. A property transfer. Her family's land and the sale of debts following her death. "She died in Voss's house 18 months before I married him." "She didn't die from illness," Margaret said. "The official record says fever." "Half this county knows the real story and nobody has ever said it publicly." Her jaw tightened. "Because nobody believed it would matter." "It matters now," Harlan said from his chair. He had been quiet through all of this, listening, and now he picked up the folder that had been on his desk and held it. "I have Miss Whitmore's medical documentation. I have the records from her treatment. I have 4 weeks of observations." He set the folder down with a finality that said something about what he had decided. "And I'd like to know who in this county is willing to stand beside that." Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Margaret Hale said me. Then Harlan said me, and then from beside Clara, Rosalie, who had no legal standing and no documented history and was 6 years old, and had been sitting very quietly in the corner with her hands in her lap, said me. Obviously, Clara looked at the 6-year-old. Rosalie looked back at her without flinching. "Rosalie," Elias started her. Rosalie said. "I'm the one who saw her fingers move. I was there." She looked at him with the same direct clarity she had looked at Garrett with, and at the window when Voss rode up, and at every moment in the past weeks when something hard needed looking at steadily. "I have something to say, and I'm going to say it." The room was very quiet. Harlan looked at Elias with an expression that walked the line between helpless and deeply impressed. Elias looked at his daughter. "All right," he said. Then he looked at the room. "Then it's 5 of us," he said. "And we need a lawyer." The lawyer was a woman named Grace Sutton, which surprised everyone in Millhaven because female lawyers were rare enough to be remarkable in that territory. But Grace Sutton had been practicing for 11 years out of a narrow office on the 2nd floor of the bank building and had the specific reputation of someone who won cases that other lawyers said couldn't be won. Harlan knew her. He sent word that evening. She came the following morning. She was small and fast-talking and took notes in a hand nearly as small and precise as Clara's, and she read through Harlan's documentation in 7 minutes and the county records in 4, and then she set everything down and looked at Clara directly. "Tell me everything," she said, "from the beginning. Don't leave things out because you think they're too small." "The small things are usually what wins," Clara told her. All of it. Elias had not heard all of it. He had heard the outline, the years of control, the isolation, the way Nathaniel dismantled every relationship she had until she had no one but the details. The specific and precise details that Clara laid out now in that steady, deliberate voice, those were new. The household accounts she was allowed to keep, but not allowed to act on without approval. The letters from her sister that arrived opened, and sometimes didn't arrive at all. The doctor Nathaniel chose for her, who had agreed with everything Nathaniel said, and prescribed things that made her feel foggy and slow, and whom she had stopped seeing by pretending to take what he gave her and hiding it instead. The night she decided to run, not the night they found her, but the night 3 weeks before that, when she had overheard Nathaniel on the phone, talking about a property in the Eastern Territory, and she had understood, with a coldness that went all the way through, that he was planning to move, and that if he moved her with him, she would never find the ground she needed to leave. So she ran, and his men found her on the 3rd day. And they left her beside a creek in January. Grace Sutton wrote throughout. When Clara finished, Grace set her pen down and looked at her notes and then looked up. "You have a strong case," she said. "I want to be honest with you, it's not certain. He has resources, and he has lawyers, and he will fight this with everything he has. But you have medical documentation. You have witnesses. You have property records showing a pattern, and you have a county record that shows he has done this before." She paused. "And you have something else." "What?" Clara said. "You," Grace said. "You're not who he says you are. Anyone who spends 5 minutes with you can see that. The woman he describes confused, unstable, a danger to herself is not the woman sitting across from me. And juries are perceptive, Miss Whitmore. They look at people and they decide." Clara was very still for a moment. "What do I need to do?" she asked. "Be exactly who you are," Grace said. "Don't apologize for it. Don't soften it. Don't make yourself smaller to be easier to believe." She looked at her steadily. "The woman he spent years trying to make you believe you were, she doesn't exist. Show them the woman who does." Something happened in Clara's face when Grace said that. It was not dramatic, it was very quiet. The kind of shift that happens inside something structural, a change in how weight is distributed, a settling into a different foundation. She looked at Elias. He nodded once. She looked back at Grace. "When does this start?" she asked. "It's already started," Grace said. "Voss filed a writ yesterday with the county court. We have 10 days to respond. I'm going to respond tomorrow morning." The 10 days that followed were the most grueling of Elias's adult life, and that included the winter his wife got sick. Voss moved efficiently, the way he did everything with the smooth momentum of a man who understood systems and knew how to use them. He had 2 lawyers and a character witness from the Eastern Territory, a physician who had documentation that had been treated for episodes of hysteria and confusion, a neighbor who was prepared to testify that she had behaved erratically on multiple occasions. Grace dismantled the physician in 2 hours of preparation. His documentation was signed by a man who had also signed a property deed that transferred 40 acres to Nathaniel Voss's company 3 months after Clara and Nathaniel married. His objectivity was not what it appeared to be. The neighbor was trickier. He believed what he said. Elias drove out to speak to him on the 4th day alone, and sat with the man on his porch and talked about Voss for a long time. And the man a decent, ordinary person who had simply taken Nathaniel at his word, because Nathaniel was credible and convenient, began slowly to look uncomfortable. Elias did not pressure him, he simply asked questions. He asked what specifically he had seen. He asked who had told him what it meant. He asked whether he had ever spoken to Clara directly. The man was quiet for a long time after that last question. "No," he said. "He mostly kept her at home." "Did that seem right to you at the time?" Elias said. A longer pause. "I didn't think about it," the man said. "I know," Elias said. "Neither did I about a lot of things until I had a reason to look closer." The man did not testify. Margaret Hale did. She stood up in the county courthouse on the 8th day and she told the story of Hale and the land deal and the 6 months that followed and the riding accident that was not an accident. And she did it in the same straight, flat way she had done it in Harlan's office, stones in a row, and the room was very still while she spoke. Voss's lawyer cross-examined her for 30 minutes. She did not change a word. Harlan testified he read from his documentation. He explained, in medical language that he then translated into plain speech, what the injuries he had treated represented. He used the phrase repeated and sustained over an extended period 3 times, and each time said it. The room got a little quieter. Voss sat through all of it with the same composed, concerned expression, and his lawyers objected at measured intervals, and he leaned over occasionally to speak to them in a low voice, and he looked like exactly what he had always looked like. A reasonable man dealing with an unfortunate situation. Then Clara testified. She walked to the front of that room, and she sat down, and she looked at the judge, and she did not look at Nathaniel, not at first, and she answered Grace's questions in her own voice, that voice that was level and precise and carried every word with the weight of someone who had thought carefully about what was true and was only going to say what was true. She talked about the accounts she wasn't allowed to act on, the letters that arrived opened, the doctor she stopped seeing, the phone call she overheard, the night she ran, the 3 days before his men found her. The creek. She talked about the creek. She said it plainly. She said that when she lay down in the grass beside that water, she did not expect to get up. She said she had stopped expecting things by that point. She said she had been so thoroughly convinced, over so many years, that she was the problem, confused, unstable, a burden and a danger to herself, that lying in the cold in January felt like a logical conclusion to a life she had been told she was failing at. The room did not make a sound, and then she said, "A little girl saw my fingers move." She said it simply, no drama, no swelling in the voice. Just the fact of it, placed in the room like something solid. Her name is Rosalie Crow. She's 6 years old. She had never met me in her life. She saw my fingers move, and she told her father, and her father picked me up and carried me out of that field, and neither of them knew who I was or what was following me, or what it would cost them to help me. She paused. And I want to say that I have spent years believing I was someone no one would stop for. Someone who didn't warrant the trouble. Someone whose word couldn't be trusted, and whose mind couldn't be trusted, and who was fundamentally not worth the difficulty. Her voice was completely steady. I know now that was something I was taught. I know now it was not the truth. She looked at Nathaniel Voss for the first time. He looked back at her with that calm, composed face. She did not look away. "I am not confused," she said. "And I am not yours." The room held it. Voss's lawyer stood up and said, "Your Honor, the witness is clearly emotional." "The witness is clearly speaking," the judge said, with a dryness that cut the sentence off cleanly. "Continue, Miss Whitmore," she continued. She was on the stand for 2 hours. Voss's lawyer came at her from every angle. He had the instability documentation, the physician's records, the neighbor who had ultimately not shown up, the evidence of her departure in a state of confusion and distress. Grace had prepared her for all of it, and Clara answered every question with the same thing. Was it actually true? Not what sounded better, not what was easier to defend. What was true? At one point, Voss's lawyer asked her whether she could admit that she had been at times confused and distressed during her marriage. She said yes. "Thank you," he said, moving on. "I wasn't finished," she said. He stopped. "I was confused and distressed," she said, "because I was living with a man who was methodically dismantling my ability to trust my own perception. That is what he does. It is not evidence of a condition I was born with. It is evidence of a condition I was put in." Voss's lawyer sat down. Grace said simply, nothing further. The judge recessed for the afternoon. Elias sat in the corridor with Rosalie beside him, and they waited, and neither of them spoke for a long time. And then Rosalie said, "She was incredible." Yes, she didn't shake, not once. No. I would have shaken. I would have too. Rosalie leaned against his arm. "She held on, Papa," she said, like on the horse. She just held on. He put his arm around his daughter, and they sat there in the corridor and waited for the world to decide. The deliberation took 3 hours. Grace came out of the judge's chambers with a face that was professionally composed, but with something underneath it that was not composed at all, and she walked directly to Clara, and she said, in a low and steady voice, "The writ is dismissed. The instability documentation is ruled insufficient against the medical counter-evidence. His custody claim has no legal standing in this jurisdiction." She paused. And the judge has referred the matter of the property transfers, including Helen's family land, to the territory court for further review. The silence lasted about 2 seconds. Then Margaret Hale, who was standing 3 feet away, made a sound that was not crying and not laughing, and was something in between that had no clean name, and she put her hand over her mouth. Clara stood very still. Elias watched her face. She didn't collapse. She didn't make a dramatic sound. She stood there in that corridor, and her face did something very quiet and very total, like a building that has been held up by the wrong frame for years, and the correct frame has just been put in place, and the strain releases all at once without fanfare. She turned to Elias. "It's not over," Grace said. "The territory court will take time. He'll challenge this." "He has resources." "I know," Clara said. She was still looking at Elias. "But today," Grace said, "you're free." Rosalie came around her father's arm and stood in front of Clara and looked up at her with that serious face and those clear eyes. "Told you," she said. Clara looked down at the 6-year-old who had seen her fingers move in the January grass, who had held her hand on the horse ride home, who had brought her soup and talked about calves, and sat beside her through the fever nights and argued about names with a ferocity that was also, at its core, a form of love. She crouched down to Rosalie's level. "You did," she said. And then she did something she had not done since Elias pulled her out of that field. She let go of the thing she had been holding on to, not the hope, not the strength, but the brace, the permanent readiness for the next blow, and she put her arms around Rosalie Crowe and held on. Rosalie held on right back. Over Clara's shoulder, Elias looked at the door of the courthouse, through which Nathaniel Voss had already departed without drama, without confrontation, with the smooth and practiced exit of a man who was already calculating his next move. He was not done. Grace was right about that, but today he had lost. And the woman he had spent years trying to unmake was standing in a courthouse corridor in Millhaven, Montana Territory, holding a 6-year-old girl, and she was whole. Voss left Millhaven the same afternoon the writ was dismissed, and the town noticed. Not because he made a scene, he didn't. He checked out of the hotel on Franklin Street, settled his bill without complaint, shook hands with the clerk, and rode out with his men in the same composed, unhurried way he had arrived. But Millhaven was a small county, and small counties ran on information the way ranches ran on water. And by supper time that evening, every person who mattered knew that Nathaniel Voss had walked into that courthouse with 2 lawyers and a fistful of documentation, and walked out without a single thing he came for. Margaret Hale heard it at her boarding house and said nothing, just went to the kitchen and made a pot of coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, and sat with it alone for a long time. Harlan heard it in his office and allowed himself exactly 1 moment of satisfaction before going back to a patient who needed his attention. Rosalie heard it on the ride home from the courthouse and said, "Good," and then asked if they could stop and check on Margaret the calf. They stopped and checked on Margaret the calf. She responded to her name. Rosalie was quietly triumphant. Clara sat on the front seat of the wagon beside Elias and did not say much on the way back. He didn't push. He had learned, over the past weeks, the difference between Clara's silences, which ones were withdrawal and which ones were processing, which ones needed company and which ones needed room. This one needed room. She was sitting with something large and unfamiliar, turning it over, and she needed the space of the ride and the cold air and the ordinary sound of the horses to do it in. When they pulled up to the ranch, she got down from the wagon and stood for a moment looking at the house. Just looking at it. The way she had looked at things in the first days when she was cataloging whether they were safe. "It doesn't feel real yet," she said. "It will," he said. "How long did it take you," she glanced at him, "after your wife, for things to feel real again?" He thought about it honestly, the way she deserved. "About a year," he said. "And then one morning I came in from the barn, and Rosalie had made coffee, and it was terrible. She was 4 years old. She had put in twice the grounds and forgotten to let it brew, and I drank it anyway, and I thought, this is my life. And it felt real, not good yet, but real." Clara looked at him. "She was 4, and she was already making coffee?" she said. "She was 4, and she was already running the household," he said. I was decorative. Clara made that sound again, the one that was almost a laugh. It was coming more easily now, that almost law, he noticed. She went inside. He unhitched the horses and put them up and stood in the barn for a few minutes in the quiet, his hands resting on the stall gate, thinking about Grace's words in the corridor. It's not over. He will challenge this. He has resources. He had resources too now. Not money. He would never match Voss in money. But Harlan had his documentation. Margaret Hale had her testimony. Grace Sutton had 11 years of winning cases that couldn't be won. And the territory court had been given the property transfer records, which meant there were people with authority looking at a pattern that Nathaniel Voss had spent years counting on nobody seeing. That wasn't nothing. He went inside. Rosalie was already at the stove, which was either a good sign or a warning, depending on what she was attempting. Clara was at the kitchen table with the lamp lit, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that she had made herself, and she was looking at the window with that middle-distance expression that said she was somewhere else in her mind. She came back when she heard him. "I want to write to my sister," she said. He stopped. She looked at him steadily. "She's in Colorado. She married a man Nathaniel didn't approve of, which is the best possible recommendation for a man, as far as I'm concerned now. I haven't spoken to her in 4 years. He intercepted the letters." She paused. Grace said the legal situation is stable enough now that contact isn't a risk. "I want to write to her." "Then write to her," he said. "I don't know what to say." He hung his coat. He sat down across from her. "Start with that you're alive," he said. She looked at the table for a moment. "That's a reasonable place to start," she said quietly. She wrote the letter that night, after Rosalie was in bed, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp pulled close, and he worked nearby on the harness straps that still needed finishing, and neither of them talked. But the silence was the kind that had stopped needing to be filled, the kind that two people fall into when they have gotten past the performance of company and into the real thing. She was still writing when he went to bed. In the morning, the letter was on the table, folded and addressed in that small, precise hand. He took it to town with the week's post and didn't mention it, and she didn't mention it, and 3 weeks later a letter came back. He brought it home and set it on the table, without comment. She stood and stared at it for a full 30 seconds before she picked it up. He went outside to give her the room. When he came back in, 20 minutes later, she was sitting at the table with the letter flat in front of her, and her face was wet, and she was not pretending otherwise. And Rosalie was sitting beside her with her small hand on Clara's arm, not talking, just there. He got coffee. He sat down. After a while, Clara said she wants to come. "My sister. She says she's been looking for me for 2 years and she never stopped." Her voice was rough. She thought. She stopped. She pressed her lips together. He told her I had chosen to cut off contact, that I found the relationship too difficult for my condition. The room was very quiet. She believed him for about 6 months, Clara said. And then she didn't, and she's been trying to find me since. "She found you," Rosalie said. Clara looked at her. "She found you," Rosalie said again, with the simple certainty of a child who understood that the only important part of the sentence was the verb. The sister's name was Ruth, and she arrived 5 weeks later, on the Tuesday afternoon stage, from the rail junction 60 miles south, and Clara was standing in front of the post office in Millhaven when the stage pulled up. And when Ruth stepped down, they grabbed each other in the middle of the street and held on with the specific ferocity of two people who had rehearsed this reunion for years without knowing if it would ever happen. Elias and Rosalie stood at a discreet distance. Rosalie watched with her arms crossed and an expression of deep emotional satisfaction. "That's what it should look like," she said. "What should look like?" Elias said. "People finding each other," she said. "It should look like that." Ruth stayed at the boarding house. Margaret Hale gave her a room, at a rate that was possibly the most charitable in the history of the enterprise, and she came to the ranch for supper the following evening. She was younger than Clara by 4 years, and she did not have Clara's precision or her stillness, but she had the same gray eyes and the same way of listening to everything before she spoke. And when she sat at Elias's kitchen table and looked around at the dried flowers and the ledger and the charcoal horse drawings Rosalie had tacked to the wall and the general evidence of three people who had figured out how to live together, she looked at Clara and said, "Okay, tell me everything. From the beginning, I want all of it." Clara told her all of it. Elias found reasons to be in other parts of the house during some of it because some of it was not his to hear. But he heard enough, and what he heard, pieced together with what he already knew, assembled into something complete. The full shape of what Clara had survived. Ruth was very quiet at the end. Then she said, "I'm going to say something, and I need you to not argue with me." "I'll try," Clara said. "You should have gotten out years before you did." "I know. I'm not blaming you. I'm saying you stayed in something that was destroying you. Because he made you believe the destruction was your own fault, and that's what he does. That's what men like him do. They make the walls look like weather." She stopped. "But you got out, and you survived. And you're sitting here in this kitchen that smells like coffee and old leather and someone who knows how to cook." And your voice caught slightly. "You're you, Clara. You're still you. He didn't get that." "He tried and he didn't get it." Clara looked at her sister across the table. "I know," she said, and this time when she said it, it sounded like she actually did. Ruth turned to Elias. He met her eyes, and she studied him with that same gray-eyed thoroughness, and he understood he was being assessed in a way that was quite serious, and he stood still for it. "Thank you," Ruth said. Simply, directly, without any of the polite scaffolding that usually surrounded those words. "Your sister did the hard part," he said. "She always has," Ruth said. "But she shouldn't have had to do it alone, and she didn't." So she held his gaze. Thank you. The territory court review took longer. Grace had warned them it would. The machinery of legal institutions moved at its own pace and not at the pace of the people waiting on it, and in the meantime Nathaniel Voss was not idle. He filed 2 challenges to the county court decision, both of which Grace answered without apparent difficulty. He had his Eastern physician submit an addendum to the instability documentation, which Harlan answered with a counter-addendum that was twice as long and considerably more specific. He had a lawyer approach Margaret Hale privately with what was described as a settlement offer and what was actually suggestion that she stop talking about Thomas. Margaret Hale told that lawyer where he could put his settlement offer, in terms that were reported around Millhaven for weeks afterward. Through all of it, life at the ranch moved forward. That was the thing Elias hadn't anticipated, that life would simply keep going regardless of what was unresolved. That the calves still needed tending and the accounts still needed balancing, and Rosalie still needed someone to hear her very specific opinions about everything. And that the forward motion was not an avoidance of what was happening, but was itself a kind of answer to it. The ranch was real, the work was real, Margaret the calf was real and growing fast and had opinions of her own. Clara became indispensable. Not in the way that people become indispensable through dependency, the way Elias had half expected and half feared, not by needing the ranch but by building something with it. She renegotiated the hay contract in March and got terms 15% better than the previous year. She reorganized the supply accounts in a way that made the cash flow actually legible for the first time. She noticed that one of the horses was favoring her left foreleg 3 days before it would have become a serious problem, and said so plainly, and was right. She also taught Rosalie long division, which Elias had been dreading since November. Rosalie learned it in 4 days. She explains it differently than the school primer, Rosalie reported. The primer makes it sound like a punishment. Clara makes it sound like a puzzle. "Is that better?" Elias asked. Rosalie looked at him with the expression she used for very obvious questions. "I just said I learned it in 4 days, didn't I?" March turned to April. The days got longer and the ground thawed, and the particular quality of light that came spring in Montana moved over the valley, and with it came something Elias had not felt in 3 years, not happiness exactly. Not the uncomplicated kind, but something adjacent to it. A sense of movement in the right direction, a sense that the walls of his life had expanded slightly from where they had contracted to after he lost his wife. He was aware of it. He was careful with it. Clara was aware of it too. He could tell by the way she sometimes paused in a conversation, a half-second longer than the thought required. The way she occasionally looked at him, when she thought he wasn't looking, and then went back to what she was doing with a deliberateness that was its own kind of acknowledgement. They had spent 3 months in close quarters, with serious things between them, and they had navigated it with a care that he respected and that he thought was grateful for. Neither of them rushed it. One evening in April he was on the porch after supper, and she came out and stood beside him, and they looked at the valley for a while without talking, and then she said, "Grace sent word today." He waited. "The territory court has accepted the property transfer review. It's formal now. They're looking at Helen's family land and 2 other transfers that came up in the documentation." She paused. "It's going to take another year at least, maybe more." "Can you wait that long?" She thought about it. "A year ago I would have said no. I would have said I need it resolved, I need it finished, I need the door closed." She looked at the valley. "But I've learned something about waiting. It's only unbearable when you have nothing." "When you have something," she stopped. She looked at him. "When you have something, waiting is just time." He looked at her. She was backlit by the last of the evening light, and she was not the woman he had carried out of that field. She was the same person, but that person had been so compressed, so reduced by everything she'd survived, and now there was room in her. Room he could see. "Clara," he said. "Don't say something careful," she said. He stopped. She turned toward him slightly. "You're very good at being careful. It's one of the best things about you. But I've spent years with a man who was calculating everything he said, and I can tell the difference now between calculating and careful, and I know you're being careful and not calculating, and she stopped. She looked back at the valley. "I'd like you to just say the thing." He looked at her for a long moment. "I don't want you to leave," he said. "And I'm aware that's not a simple thing to say given everything. And I'm not asking you for anything, but I wanted you to know." She was quiet. "No," she said. "You've known?" "Rosalie told me," she said. And there was that almost law, fuller this time, more committed. "She told me 2 weeks ago that her father was bad at saying things out loud, but very good at meaning them, and that she thought I should know he meant a lot of things he wasn't saying." He closed his eyes briefly. "She's 6 years old," he said. "She's not really," Clara said. "Not in any way that matters." He looked at her. "I don't want to leave either," she said. She said it the way she said things that were true plainly, without decoration, with the full weight of having considered it. "I am aware that I came here with nothing, and that it wouldn't look that some people would say." "I don't care what some people would say," he said. "I know. That's part of why." She looked at him. I need you to understand that I'm not staying because I have nowhere else to go. Ruth is here. Grace has offered to let me assist in the office while the territory case runs. I have options now, real ones." She was very serious, very direct. "I'm saying I don't want to leave because I don't want to leave. Not because I can't. That's all I needed to know," he said. The following morning, Rosalie came down to breakfast and looked at the 2 of them at the kitchen table. Clara with the ledger, Elias with his coffee. Both of them sitting in the particular comfortable way of people who have cleared some ground and know it, and she said nothing. She poured herself some milk, sat down, looked at her long division practice from the day before, and then looked up. "Did you 2 finally talk?" she asked. "Mind your business," Elias said. "My business is this household," Rosalie said with great dignity. "We talked," Clara said. Rosalie nodded. She said and went back to her long division. The second twist came in May. Grace appeared at the ranch on a Thursday afternoon without sending word ahead, which was unusual enough that Elias knew when he saw her coming up the road that heads had broken one way or the other. She tied her horse at the gate and came up to the porch, where he and Clara were working on the next quarter's projections, and she sat down and put her bag on her knees and looked at them both. "I have news," she said, "and it's complicated." "Say it," Clara said. "The territory court found the property transfers irregular." All three of them, including Helen's family land. Grace paused. They've opened a formal investigation into Nathaniel Voss's business practices. Not just the property transfers, his financial dealings broadly. There are 3 other parties who have come forward in the past month, people who have been waiting for something exactly like this to become possible. The porch was very quiet. That's good news, Elias said. It is, Grace said. Here's the complicated part. She looked at Clara. His lawyers have been in contact with mine. He wants to settle. Clara went very still. He wants to what, she said. Settle. Out of court, before the investigation gets further. Grace set her bag down. He's offering to dissolve the marriage formally, relinquish all claims, provide a financial settlement, and agree to not contest the territory investigation findings. She paused. In exchange for you signing a statement that confirms the marriage was dissolved by mutual agreement and that you make no further public claims regarding your time in his household. The silence was so complete that Elias could hear the horses in the barn. He wants me to be quiet, Clara said. In exchange for money and freedom, Grace said. Yes. Clara looked at the yard. She looked at her hands. She looked at the wall of the house, where the afternoon light was starting to hit differently as spring moved toward summer. She looked at Elias. He looked back at her and said nothing. This was not his to answer. He knew it and she knew it. He just held her eyes and let her know he was there. What happens to the investigation if I settle? She said to Grace. The other 3 parties continue. The investigation doesn't depend on you. But your testimony, Grace chose the next words carefully. Your testimony would be unavailable, and you are the most credible and the most direct witness to what his methods are. And Helen, Clara said, what happens to Helen's story? Grace was quiet for a moment. Helen is gone. She has no living advocates that we've found. Her family's land is part of the financial review, regardless of your decision. But no one will hear what happened to her, not from this proceeding. No. Clara stood up from her chair. She walked to the edge of the porch and stood there with her back to both of them. Elias watched her shoulders. He watched her breathe. She turned around. She said. Grace looked at her. Clara, no settlement, no statement, no silence. She said each one separately, the way she had said, I am not confused. I am not lost. I am not yours in that courthouse corridor. He spent years making me silent. I'm not signing a document that does his work for him. Her voice was steady. And Helen deserves someone to say what happened. Grace studied her for a long moment. You understand what this means, Grace said. It gets harder before it gets resolved. He'll fight this with everything he has. It could be years, I know, Clara said, and the money. I have work, Clara said. She looked at Elias briefly. I have work and I have people and I'm not interested in his money. She looked back at Grace. Tell his lawyers no, and tell them I'll be a full witness for the territory court for as long as they need me. Grace looked at her, then she looked at Elias, then she picked up her bag. All right, she said. And something in her voice said she had been hoping for that answer. She left. Elias and Clara stood on the porch, and the afternoon moved around them the way afternoons do when something large has just been decided. You could have had it finished, he said. It was not a challenge. Just an acknowledgement. I could have had it quiet, she said. That's different from finished. She looked at the road where Grace's horse was diminishing into the distance. He needs people to be quiet to keep doing what he does. Helen was quiet. I was quiet for years. She paused. I'm done being quiet. Rosalie appeared in the doorway behind them, having heard more than she was supposed to hear, with an expression that suggested she had heard all of it and found it entirely satisfactory. Good, she said. Were you listening at the door? Elias said. I was standing near the door, Rosalie said, for unrelated reasons. Clara looked at her. That almost law again, closer now, closer each time. Come here, she said. Rosalie came to stand beside her. Clara put one hand on the girl's shoulder. Both of them looked out at the valley, at the spring-lit land, at the ranch that was one woman's home and another woman's chosen place, and a little girl's whole world. We're going to be all right, aren't we? Rosalie said. It was not quite a question, Clara said, even with all of it still going on. Even with all of it, Clara said, because all of it doesn't live here. We do. Rosalie considered this. She looked at her father. He looked at his daughter, and at the woman beside her, and at the house behind them with its dried flowers and precise ledger margins and its 2 sizes too large wool hat on the hook by the door. And he thought about a January morning and a frozen creek and a small hand that had grabbed his sleeve and changed the direction of everything. She's right, he said. Rosalie accepted this verdict and went back inside, and Clara and Elias stayed on the porch as the evening started to come in, and the valley went gold and then gray and then quiet, and neither of them felt the need to fill it. What they had built in that house in those months was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was the accumulated weight of ordinary days stacked carefully one on top of another, shared work and honest words, and a little girl who refused to look away from anything that needed looking at. It was not finished. The territory court would run its course, and Grace would fight her fights, and Nathaniel Voss would not disappear into nothing overnight. The world outside was not fixed, but the world inside the ranch house on the north side of Millhaven, Montana territory was something real. And real, as Elias had once told his daughter about the worst year of his life, was where you started from. You started from real, and you built from there. The summer that followed was the quietest Elias had known in years, and he understood enough about quiet to know it was not the same as peaceful. Peaceful was what you felt when nothing was coming. Quiet was what you built in spite of what was still coming. They were not the same thing, and the people in that ranch house understood the difference in their bones. The territory court investigation moved forward on its own calendar, indifferent to the people waiting on it. Grace sent updates every 2 weeks, a deposition here, a document subpoena there, the slow grinding machinery of justice doing what it did at the pace it chose. 2 of the 3 other parties who had come forward were former business associates of Voss, men who had watched land transfer out of families they knew under circumstances that didn't hold up to scrutiny. The third was a woman none of them had expected. Her name was Ada Marsh, and she had been Nathaniel Voss's housekeeper for 11 years, from before his first wife Helen, through the early years of his marriage to Clara, and she had left his employ 6 months before Clara ran. And she had kept her mouth closed for 18 months because she had 2 children and no savings, and the specific fear of a woman who has seen what a powerful man does to people who speak against him. Grace found her through a letter Ada had written to the county clerk 3 years prior, flagging an irregularity in a property filing that she didn't understand but that had seemed wrong to her. The clerk had done nothing with it. Grace found it in the archived correspondence and followed the thread and drove 60 miles to a town called Harker's Crossing and knocked on a door and sat at a kitchen table for 3 hours while Ada Marsh told her everything she had seen in 11 years of living inside Nathaniel Voss's household. She brought the summary to the ranch on a Wednesday in June and read portions of it to Clara at the kitchen table while Elias sat nearby, and Rosalie, who had been told to do her arithmetic in the other room, did her arithmetic in the other room for approximately 4 minutes before appearing in the doorway and being waved in by Clara without comment. What Ada had seen was not new in shape, it was new in detail, and detail was what made it matter. She had seen Helen's last weeks. She had seen the progression of what was officially called a fever, and what Ada had understood, in the wordless way of people who live inside a truth without being able to name it, was something deliberate. She had not understood it fully. She had not had language for it. But she had written down what she observed in a notebook she kept under a floorboard in her quarters, because something in her had known that what she was watching needed to be recorded. And she had kept that notebook for 11 years, and now Grace Sutton had a copy of every page. Clara listened to all of it without moving. When Grace finished, she sat back and looked at Clara and waited. She was there the whole time, Clara said. Ada was there the whole time I was there. We spoke almost every day. Yes, she knew, she suspected, Grace said carefully. And she was afraid. And she had children. Those aren't small things. No, Clara said. They're not. She was quiet for a moment. Is she all right, Ada? Is she safe? Grace looked at her. She had not expected that question first. She's all right, Grace said. She has a sister in Harker's Crossing. She's been there since she left his employ. Clara nodded slowly. I want to write to her, Clara said. I can arrange that. Not through lawyers, Clara said. Just I want to write to her and tell her that I understand why she didn't say anything sooner, and that I don't hold it against her, and that what she's doing now is that it matters. She looked at Grace. Can you get a letter to her? Yes, Grace said. She straightened. She picked up her pencil. She was already somewhere else in her mind, already building the next thing. What do we need from me for the territory court? Another deposition, Grace said, more specific than the last. They want to go through the timeline in detail, the full duration of the marriage. Every incident you can document. When? 3 weeks. Clara wrote it down in the margin of the ledger. She wrote it in the same small, precise hand she used for everything, as if a deposition were another number to be entered correctly and verified. Then she looked up. All right, she said. Grace studied her for a moment. You know this is going to be hard. I know. Harder than the county court. The territory court will go deeper. I know, Grace. I just want to make sure. I have been waiting my entire marriage for someone to ask me to tell the truth in a room where it would be recorded, Clara said. I am not afraid of it. Grace was quiet. Then she said no. I don't suppose you are. Rosalie, from her position at the table where she had been doing arithmetic with one ear clearly pointed at the adults, said, without looking up, she's the bravest person I know. Nobody argued with her. The deposition was scheduled. The weeks between it and the present moved quickly in the way that weeks move when the people living through them have things to do, and people to do them with. Clara wrote her letter to Ada Marsh. Ada wrote back within a week a letter that was short and not easy, and that Clara read twice and then folded and put in the small box she had started keeping on the shelf above the bed. The box that held Ruth's first letter and a note from Harlan and a piece of paper where Rosalie had written, in her best printing, "You don't have to hold on alone anymore." Clara had found that note tucked under her coffee cup one morning without comment or explanation, and she had read it and sat with it for a long time, and she had put it in the box. The box was getting full. 3 days before the deposition, something happened that nobody had planned for. Elias was in town for supplies when he ran into a man he knew slightly, a rancher from the North County named Beale, a decent enough man who kept to himself and his business and was not given to gossip. Beale caught his arm outside the feed store and said, low and direct, Elias. Word is Voss has been talking to people. Elias looked at him. What kind of people? The kind with influence in the territory court. Not judges, but adjacent. Beale looked uncomfortable. I don't know if it's true. I'm telling you, because I heard it and it seemed like something you'd want to know. Who told you? Beale named a name. Acleus knew it, a man who worked at the territory court office, a clerk who processed filings and who had a side income and information that various interested parties found useful to purchase. Not illegal exactly, but not nothing. He thanked Beale and drove back to the ranch faster than he'd gone out. Grace was there when he arrived. She had come to do a preliminary review with Clara for the deposition, and they were at the kitchen table when he came through the door, and both of them looked at his face and stopped talking. He told them what Beale had said. Grace was very still for a moment. Then she set down her pen. The clerk's name, she said. He told her. She picked her pen back up and wrote it down and was quiet for a while, thinking something through. This is not unusual, she said finally. Men with resources, when they feel a proceeding going against them, look for leverage in the machinery. It doesn't mean he's succeeded. It means he's scared. Is that good? Rosalie asked from the other room, where she had once again been doing arithmetic. Rosalie, Elias said. It's relevant, Rosalie said, appearing in the doorway. Grace looked at the 6-year-old. She had been doing this for 11 years, and she had never had a client with a 6-year-old advisor, and she had found, over the past months, that this was a significant gap in her prior experience. It's good, Grace said, in that people who are winning don't try to interfere with the process. It's concerning in the sense that interference is interference, even when it fails. What do we do? Clara asked. I have a colleague in the territory court, Grace said. I'm going to have a conversation with her today. And I'm going to file a motion that puts what I know about Voss's pattern of behavior, the documented pattern, the one that's already in the record in front of the presiding judge, before anything else gets to him. She paused. Context is everything in these proceedings. I want the judge to know what kind of man he's dealing with before anyone starts talking about who's been talking to whom. She stood up and gathered her papers. The deposition stands, she said to Clara. Don't change anything. Don't let him see you adjust. She looked at her steadily. He wants you to be afraid. He wants you to pull back or make a mistake or give him something to use. Don't give him anything. Clara looked at her. I stopped being afraid of him the day I lay down in that creek and decided I would rather die there than live one more year inside his house, she said. Whatever he does now is just noise. Grace looked at her for a long moment. Right, she said. Good, she put her coat on. I'll be in touch. She left. Elias and Clara stood in the kitchen, and Rosalie stood in the doorway, and the house was very quiet for a moment. Then Rosalie said, Can I help with the deposition? You're 6, Elias said. I'm almost 7, Rosalie said. And I was there. I found her. I'm a witness. You've said your piece, sweetheart. I can say it again. Rosalie, he looked at his daughter. You've already done something most people twice your age couldn't do. You can let the grown people handle this part. She considered this with visible reluctance. Fine, she said, but I'm going to be there. No, you're not. Papa, you're going to school, he said, which you haven't been to in 3 weeks. Rosalie opened her mouth. The deposition is not more important than school, he said. I would argue. She closed her mouth. She looked at Clara. Clara was looking at her with that expression, the one that was not quite a smile, and was more than a smile, the one that had been getting fuller and more comfortable as the months went by. Go to school, Clara said, and come home and tell me everything you learned. Will you be all right? Rosalie asked her, very directly, with none of the performance of a child asking and all of the weight of someone who genuinely needed the answer. Clara crossed the room and crouched down in front of her. I will be all right, she said. I promise you, this is just something I have to go say, and I'm going to say it, and then I'm going to come home. Rosalie looked at her. You said home, she said. Clara paused. I did, she said. Rosalie processed this with an expression that did everything it could not to show how much it meant, and mostly failed. Okay, she said, then go say it. The deposition lasted 4 hours. Elias sat in the corridor outside the territory court office in the county seat and waited. He had brought the accounts to review, but he didn't look at them. He sat with his hat in his hands, and he listened to the building around him, footsteps, voices, doors. The ordinary sounds of official proceedings, and he thought about a woman in a room 50 feet away, telling a true story to people with the authority to act on it. She had told him the night before that she was not nervous. He had believed her, and also understood that not nervous was different from not feeling anything. She was feeling plenty. She was just not letting it drive. She'll do fine, a voice said. He looked up. Grace was standing beside him, which surprised him because he thought Grace was in the room. Aren't you? They sent me out for a recess, Grace said. She sat down beside him. 15 minutes. She was quiet for a moment. She's extraordinary in there. I want you to know that. The territory recorder asked her to slow down twice because she was being so specific and so thorough that he couldn't keep up. She paused. She's not performing. She's not being emotional for effect. She's just telling them what happened with the precision of a woman who kept every detail in her memory for years because she knew someday she'd need it. Elias looked at the floor. Did she always know she'd get out, he asked. I don't think she let herself know it, Grace said. I think she hoped it in a place so deep she couldn't afford to look at it directly. And then one morning in January, a little girl saw her fingers move, he said. Yes, Grace said, and here we are, the recess ended. Grace went back in, Elias went back to waiting. When Clara came out 2.5 hours later, she walked down the corridor toward him with a straight spine and a face that was tired in the way that honest work makes a person tired, not broken, not relieved. Not the aftermath of something survived, but the clean exhaustion of a thing done properly. She sat down beside him. He said nothing. She said nothing. After a minute, she said, "They asked about Helen. And I told them everything I knew, which isn't much. But Ada's account fills what I couldn't." She looked at her hands. The recorder's face when I described what I'd overheard, the phone call the night before I ran, he went very still. That kind of still that people go when they've just understood something they didn't understand before. "Good. Grace thinks we have enough," she said. "Not just to hold the findings against the transfers. She thinks we have enough for them to refer a criminal inquiry." He looked at her. "For Helen," she said. The words sat between them. "How do you feel about that?" he asked. She thought about it for a long time. "Like I did the right thing," she said. "Like I said what she would have said if she'd had the chance." She paused. "Like I paid a debt I didn't know I owed her until I understood what we had in common." He reached out and took her hand. She looked down at their hands. Then she looked at him, and she didn't look away, and he didn't look away, and what was between them had been building since January, and had been patient and careful and real. And neither of them needed to say it out loud right there, in a territory court corridor, to know that it was true. She turned her hand over and held his. They sat there for a while. Then she said, "Can we go home?" "Yes," he said, "we can go home." The criminal inquiry referral came in August. Grace brought it to the ranch on a Friday evening. And she sat on the porch and told them that the territory court had found sufficient evidence to refer Nathaniel Voss to the district criminal court on charges related to Helen's death and 2 counts of fraudulent property acquisition. The other civil findings stood. The marriage's dissolution was final and legally recorded. The financial settlement that Voss had once offered Clara as the price of her silence was now, by court order, a substantially larger sum held in escrow pending the criminal proceedings. He would not be able to touch it. He could not access those funds to fund his defense, because those funds had been identified as proceeds of actions under criminal investigation. For the first time in his adult life, Nathaniel Voss was operating without the full weight of his money behind him. Grace told them this with the measured satisfaction of someone who had spent 11 years learning that justice was slow and could still find it meaningful when it arrived. Clara sat on the porch and listened and was very quiet for a while after Grace finished. Then she said, "What happens to him now?" "He'll retain whatever lawyers he can and fight it," Grace said. "He's good at fighting. But the criminal court is a different arena than the civil one. The standard of evidence, the weight of Ada's testimony, the medical records." She paused. "I can't promise you an outcome. I never can. But I can tell you that the people prosecuting this case are serious, and they are thorough, and they are not impressed by money." "He always found people who were impressed by money," Clara said. "I know, but not everyone is." Grace looked at her. "You changed that. By not being quiet, by staying in the proceeding, by making it impossible for him to contain this, you made it possible for other people to come forward. Ada, the business associates, the clerk Beale heard about, who, when faced with a motion from my office making clear that his conduct was known, decided very quickly that his loyalty to Voss was not worth his position." She paused. "This is what it looks like when the narrative breaks. Not all at once, piece by piece, person by person, until there's nothing left for him to stand on." Clara nodded slowly. Ruth appeared in the doorway she had taken to coming to the ranch for Friday suppers. A habit that had established itself without anyone planning it, and looked at the 3 of them on the porch and read the room with the gray-eyed thoroughness that was the Whitmore family trait. "Good news?" she asked. "The beginning of the end," Grace said. Ruth looked at her sister. Clara looked back at her. "Come sit down," Clara said. Ruth came and sat, and Rosalie came out from behind her, having heard everything from approximately 3 feet inside the door. And she came and stood in front of Clara and looked at her with those clear eyes that didn't miss anything and never had. "Is it over?" she asked. "Not all the way," Clara said. "But the most important part is." "Which part is the most important part?" Clara looked at her. "The part where he can't make anyone believe I'm not real anymore." Rosalie thought about this. Then she nodded once, with the gravity of someone filing an important piece of information correctly. "Good," she said, "because you're the realest person I know." What happened next was not a dramatic thing. It was not a moment that announced itself or asked to be remembered. It was a Friday evening on a porch in Montana Territory with the summer going warm and slow around them, and Grace Sutton was there with her bag on her lap and her work mostly done. And Ruth Whitmore was there with her solid, quiet presence and her gray eyes, and Rosalie Crowe was there being entirely and completely herself, and Elias was there the way he had been there since January, steady present, without condition. And Clara Whitmore was there, not surviving, not bracing. Not waiting for the next blow or measuring the distance to the door. Just there, in a place she had chosen, with people who had chosen her back. She stood up after a while and went to the edge of the porch and looked out at the valley. It was the same valley she had looked at since March, since she first started coming outside, first started letting the land do the work that words couldn't. She knew it differently now. She knew where the ground was softer near the north fence, and where the creek ran fast in spring, and where Margaret the calf preferred to stand in the late afternoon. She knew the way the light fell on the barn at this hour, and what it meant about how much time was left in the working day. She knew this place the way you know a place, when you have decided it is yours. Elias came to stand beside her. "You're thinking," he said. "I'm thinking," she agreed. "About what?" She was quiet for a moment. "About January," she said. "About lying in that grass and believing that was where I ended." She paused. "And about the distance between that morning and this one." He said nothing. He looked at the valley beside her. "I want to go back," she said. He looked at her. Not to go back," she said. "I want to go to the creek, where you found me. I want to stand there and look at it and know that I'm the one standing this time." She turned to him. "Will you come with me?" He looked at her for a moment. "Yes," he said. "When do you want to go?" "Tomorrow morning," she said. "Early, before it gets busy." "All right, and Rosalie," she said. She should come. From behind them, without any pretense of not having heard every word, Rosalie said, "I'm already coming." They went the following morning, all three of them, on horseback in the early light that came thin and gold over the eastern hills. Riding north through the valley on the route that Elias and Rosalie had ridden 7 months before, when the world was frozen and the fence line was the only destination, and the morning had not yet become the morning that changed everything. The creek was not frozen now. It was running clear and easy over the stones, the sound of it light and unhurried, and the grass along the banks was green and fully itself in a way that January had not allowed. Clara dismounted and stood on the bank. She looked at the place. It was not marked. There was no evidence, nothing you could point to and say there. The grass had grown back, and the water had kept moving, and the world had done what the world continued regardless, indifferent to the particular weight of what had happened in one spot on one morning in January. But she knew the place, she knew exactly where it was. And she stood in front of it and looked at it, and let herself feel the full distance between the woman who had lain down in that grass and the woman standing here now. Rosalie came to stand beside her without being asked. "This is it," she said. "This is it." Rosalie looked at the bank. She looked at the creek. She looked at Clara. "You look different here," she said. "Then you did. I am different. Not all the way," Rosalie said. "You're still you. But the part that was waiting for something bad to happen, that part is smaller." Clara looked at her. "You can see that," she said. "I've been watching you since January," Rosalie said, with the air of someone pointing out a simple fact. "I know what you look like when you're waiting for something bad to happen. You do this." She pulled her own shoulders in slightly, a subtle compression. "Like you're making yourself smaller so there's less to hit." She straightened. "You don't do that as much anymore." Clara looked at the child beside her and felt something move through her that was not small and was not quiet, but that she did not try to contain or redirect or make manageable. She crouched down. "Yes? I need to say something to you." Rosalie waited with her full attention, the way she always waited when something important was coming. "You saved my life," Clara said, "not just because you saw my fingers move. Because of every day after that. Because you talked to me about calves and long division and the proper way to bank stove coals, and because you put a note under my coffee cup, and because you sat beside me on the nights when I didn't know if I could keep going and you didn't say anything, you just sat there. She paused. You showed me what it looked like to be near someone without being afraid of them. I had forgotten that was possible, you reminded me. Rosalie's eyes were doing something they very rarely did. Papa helped, she said, with the faint unsteadiness of someone working hard to stay composed. Your father is one of the finest people I have ever known, Clara said. But you were first. Rosalie pressed her lips together. Then she put her arms around Clara's neck the way she had in the courthouse corridor, with the ferocity of someone who had claimed a thing and was not letting go of it, and Clara held her. And Elias stood a few feet away and looked at the creek, and let them have that moment with all the room it deserved. After a while, Rosalie pulled back and wiped her face with her sleeve and straightened her hat and recovered her dignity with impressive speed. Okay, she said. Good, now what? Clara stood up. She turned to face the creek one more time. She looked at the place where she had lain down and stopped expecting to get up. She looked at it for a long time. Then she turned her back on it. Not to forget it, not to pretend it hadn't happened, but to make the deliberate physical choice of which direction she was facing. She turned to Elias. He was looking at her, with that look, the one she had been learning to accept without deflecting, the one that not ask anything of her, but was simply and completely there. Ready, he said. She thought about what that question contained. Whether she was ready for the territory court to finish its work. Whether she was ready for whatever came next in the proceeding against Nathaniel Voss, the ongoing work of justice that was not finished and would not be finished quickly. Whether she was ready for a life that was hers, built by her hands in a place she had chosen among people who had chosen her a life that would have ordinary days and hard days and days, where the old fear tried to come back and she would have to look at it squarely and tell it that it did not live here anymore. Whether she was ready to love a man who split wood in the cold and couldn't name a calf and had kept dried flowers on rafters for 3 years because he couldn't take down the thing his wife had put there. She thought she was. Yes, she said. They rode home. The criminal court proceedings took another 18 months. Nathaniel Voss contested every finding, every deposition, every piece of documentation, with the systematic persistence of a man who had spent his entire life using process as a weapon. He was good at it. His remaining lawyers were good. He delayed and challenged and filed and refiled, and Grace answered every move, and Ada Marsh held her testimony through 2 rounds of cross-examination without changing a word, and the other witnesses held, and the medical records held, and the county records held, and Margaret Hale held, and in the end the accumulated weight of what was true was greater than the resources of one man who had spent decades counting on nobody looking. He was convicted on 2 counts. The property fraud and a charge that the district court called criminal negligence in relation to the circumstances of Helen's death, not murder, which the evidence could not fully establish, but something that put on record permanently, and in the official language of law, that what had happened to Helen was not a fever, and not an accident, and not the private tragedy of one unfortunate woman. It was a record now. It existed. Clara was in the courtroom when the verdict was read. She sat beside Grace and across the room from Nathaniel Voss for the last time, and she watched the judge speak the words, and she watched Voss's face in the moment he heard them. He kept his composure. Of course he did. He was a man who had built his entire life on composure. But there was something in his eyes in that one unguarded second, not fear, exactly. Something older than fear. The look of a man who has spent decades constructing a version of reality in which he is always the reasonable one, always the aggrieved party, always the victim of other people's instability and confusion, and who has just been told by an institution he cannot charm or threaten or buy that his version is not the true one. That the true one is on record, that it will stay there. Clara looked at him and felt nothing that surprised her. No triumph, because triumph required an enemy, and she had stopped thinking of him as something that had power over her. No satisfaction in his suffering, because she was not that kind of person, and she had not become that kind of person regardless of what he had done. Just a clean, settled sense of completion, of a chapter closed with the correct ending. She turned away from him before they took him out. She did not watch him go. Grace squeezed her arm once, hard, and said nothing, which was the right thing to say. Clara walked out of the courtroom into the hallway, and there was Elias, sitting in the same corridor where he had sat through her deposition, hat in his hands, and there was Rosalie beside him, 7 years old now, considerably taller than she had been in January, hat not jammed down but sitting properly on her head because she was in a courthouse and had decided that required dignity. Rosalie stood up when she saw Clara's face. "Well," she said. Clara looked at her. "It's done," she said. Rosalie let out a breath that she had clearly been holding for some time. Then she walked forward and took Clara's hand, not urgently, not with the ferocity of the courthouse moment or the creak, just simply the way you take the hand of someone who is yours and you are theirs. Elias stood. He looked at Clara the way he had been looking at her for a year and a half, with that steadiness that had been the first thing she trusted about him. The quality she had recognized from the very beginning as the thing she had never been given and had needed more than anything else. "Come on," he said, "let's go home," and they did. They went home to the ranch that smelled like coffee and old leather and dried flowers that had been hanging from the rafters for 4 years now, because nobody wanted to take them down anymore. They went home to Margaret the calf, who was a full-grown cow now and had retained her name and her opinions. They went home to a ledger that balanced properly, accounts that were understood, and a hay contract that renewed every March at terms Clara had negotiated and that the supplier had learned not to argue with. Ruth came for dinner that night. Margaret Hale came too. Harlan came. Grace came, which was unusual because Grace rarely left her office for social occasions, but this was not quite a social occasion and she seemed to understand that. They ate at the table that had started as one person's and had become everyone's. And Rosalie sat at the corner, where she always sat, and talked about everything she had been learning at school and some opinions she had developed about the proper management of grazing rotations and very specific grievance about the way the school primer explained fractions, which she felt was unnecessarily complicated. Clara sat beside Elias and listened to Rosalie and felt the weight of the room, the particular warm weight of people who have built something together and are sitting inside it. She felt it the way you feel a thing you spent years not believing was possible and are now having to learn the specific, unfamiliar work of accepting. She was getting better at that, at accepting, at letting the good thing be real without bracing for it to disappear. After dinner, after Ruth and Margaret and Harlan had gone, after Grace had stayed an extra hour for coffee and conversation and then gone too, after Rosalie had been persuaded with minimal argument to go to bed because she had school in the morning and dignity required punctuality after all of that, Elias and Clara sat on the porch in the summer dark, and the valley was quiet around them, and the stars were doing what Montana stars did, which was an unreasonable amount. She leaned against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. They sat there for a long time without speaking, which they were very good at by now, and the night moved around them, and somewhere in the direction of the barn Margaret the cow made a sound that was either commentary or complaint. And Rosalie's lamp went out in her window, and the valley kept its long breathing. Clara thought about January. She thought about lying in frozen grass and feeling the cold go through her, and believing, in the specific bottomless way of a person who has been taught to believe it for years, that she was someone who did not warrant saving. She thought about small fingers curling in dead grass. She thought about a man dismounting in a field with no hesitation. She thought about the word home and all the times she had used it in this past year, and how the first time it had surprised her coming out of her own mouth, and how it didn't surprise her anymore. She thought about Helen, whose name was in a record now, whose story had been told in a room with the authority to hear it, who had not been forgotten. She thought about Ada, who was doing well in Harker's Crossing, who wrote letters now, who was building something. She thought about Ruth, who had looked for her for 2 years and not stopped, because some things you do not stop doing, regardless of how difficult they are. She thought about what it meant to have been unmade by someone, and to have put yourself back together anyway, not into the same shape you never went back to exactly the same shape, but into something true. Something that was entirely and only yours. Elias, she said. I need to tell you something. He waited. He was good at that. I used to think the worst thing he did was the physical harm, she said. The injuries, the fear. But I've been thinking about it this past year, and I think I was wrong. She paused. The worst thing was making me believe I was someone who didn't deserve to be found. He was quiet. I think that's what people like him do, she said. They don't just hurt you, they convince you the hurting is correct. That it's logical. That if you were better or different or more careful it wouldn't happen. And since it keeps happening you must not be trying hard enough. She paused. He was very good at it. It took me years to see it, and even after I saw it, I still believed it some mornings. And now, he said, she looked at the valley. She looked at the stars over the valley. She looked at the light that was still on in Rosalie's window, because of course it was still on. Rosalie had almost certainly gotten back up and was reading something by lamplight, and had every intention of claiming she was asleep if anyone checked. Now I know I was always worth finding, she said. I just needed someone to stop. He held her a little closer. She let him. I'm glad we stopped, he said. I know, she said. So am I. And that was how it ended, not with a pronouncement, not with a declaration made for an audience, but with two people on a porch in the dark who had come through something and were sitting in the truth of what they had built on the other side of it. A man who understood that grief does not mean love is finished. A woman who understood that surviving is only the first part, and that living, choosing, building, staying is the part that matters. And inside the house, a little girl who had looked at a frozen field on a January morning and refused to look away. Who had seen something worth stopping for? Who had said the 4 words that started everything? She's still alive, she always had been, and now finally she knew it too.